Ellis B. Feaster's Radio Aircheck and Classic TV channel.
Cooking out or cooking in, ShopRite has the answer.
She loves the family. She wants the best. She does all that she can do. She lets ShopRite do the rest. Hey, Ma, what's for dinner? ShopRite has the answer.
Hello, this is Joe Franklin. Ladies and gentlemen and boys and girls, for the very latest in nostalgia, for the ultimate in remembering, please join with me on Saturday nights from 9:05 to 11 o'clock, where memories are truly happening right here over WOR Radio. It is my privilege to present radio's original Memory Lane program, but positively the original. And whether it's Al Jolson or Benny Goodman or Louis Armstrong or Eddie Cantor or Harry James or the Dorseys, Mario Lanza, Gene Krupa, the young Frank Sinatra, George M. Cohan, Bing Crosby, Bogart, Lombard, Cagney, and all those happy times of radio's comedy and drama and soap opera. We have it fascinatingly, and all the sounds are reproduced crystal clear Saturday nights from 9:05 till 11 over WOR Radio. Yours truly, Joe Franklin, hosting Memory Lane. Tune in.
This is WOR New York.
The sound you hear indicates that the mighty Memory Mobile is about to begin another trip back into the past. A trip that lets you hear and sense and almost taste what life was like not so many years ago. The Memory Mobile is an incredible vehicle that visits the past 1 year at a time. It takes two to run it, and I'm Bob Maxwell.
And I'm Gary Moore. And Bob, you know, you make this sound as if we're going to be launched into outer space or something. And in a way, I suppose we are. Tonight, we're really going to span quite a distance. So, you got your seatbelt fastened?
Yep, and I have 4 chicken sandwiches and a canteen of water. Now, you'll see why later on.
You have got what?
4 chicken sandwiches and a canteen of water.
Now, there's a straight line if I ever heard it. I'll have to wait for the punchline till later, and I'm sure you'll tell it to us. Anyway, Bob, our destination on this trip is a year which has been described as one of the very best years in American history. That is, at least in modern times. There were no wars. Almost everybody was working. Everything was pretty much on an even keel, and we had some incredible music to listen to, and a lot of very exciting things were happening. And in the year I'm talking about, we heard this voice on the radio.
Lindbergh is coming down the gangplank.
We heard this voice in the movies.
Mammy, my little Mammy, but I know where the sunshine's set. It's on my Mammy I'm talking about.
We heard this voice from Yankee Stadium. Even though 1927 was a good year by and large, our president was not a man of great flexibility in his thinking or great compassion toward most ordinary sinners.
I see what you mean, Gare. Well, looking around in 1927, remember Al Smith had been a presidential hopeful back in 1924, and in 1927 everyone thought he would run again.
Yeah.
Young Franklin D. Roosevelt was kind of an unofficial campaign manager.
As I recall it, the political trouble with Al Smith was he was a Catholic, he was a New Yorker, and he was a wet.
A what?
A wet in those days meant that you were anti-prohibition. You were in favor of booze, and that didn't go down too well in the rest of the country. I don't know whether you remember him saying. He said, "Prohibition has made a new field of endeavor for the underworld."
Of course.
For the underworld.
Then in August, Calvin Coolidge made his most famous statement, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. That was all. No explanation. Just 10 words, like a Western Union telegram.
And Bob, the outstanding event of 27 really, or at least the one that turned people on the most, was Lindbergh's trip. In 1926 or 27, one Raymond Ortag, a New York hotel owner, offered a prize of $25,000 to anyone who could fly solo from New York to Paris. And in those days, Charles A. Lindbergh was only 25 years old. He had been a barnstormer and a mail pilot, and I really don't believe he knew what fear was. Time magazine called him a flying fool. He was flying a Ryan monoplane with 450 gallons of fuel, and he set out on May 20th, 1927.
And he took with him 4 chicken sandwiches and a canteen of water and a few Army rations, I believe.
Yeah, but when he reached Paris safely, which was just 33 and a half hours later, Bob, the entire world just went off their trolley. They went bananas.
That's true. But after all that introduction, let's listen to the actual arrival home to Washington of Charles A. Lindbergh on June 11th, 1927.
Ladies and gentlemen of the radio audience, this is Graham McNamee speaking from the Navy Yard. Here is the dock. Awaiting Lindbergh. Lindbergh is coming down the gangplank. Here's the boy. He's come forward. And awfully nice. I want to express my appreciation for the reception I've had in America. When I landed at Lindbergh a few weeks ago, I landed with the expectancy and the hope of being able to see Europe. It was the first time I had ever been abroad. I'd only been gone from America for 2 days, a little less. And I wasn't in any hurry to get back. I found that it didn't make much difference whether I wanted to stay over there or not, and I was informed that while it wasn't in order to come back home, that there'd be a battleship waiting for me the next week. It is our great privilege to welcome back to his native land and have been thrilled by his splendid achievements, and as President of the United States, I bestow the Distinguished Flying Cross as a symbol of appreciation for what he is and what he has done. Charles A. Lindbergh.
Fair or windy, he's flying high. Fearless, fearless, knows every cloud. The kind of the sun makes a mother feel proud. Rocky Lindy, right all alone.
And on that note of anticlimax, oh boy, the Memory Mobile with Maxwell and Moore will take a break.
The Mighty Memory Mobile with Gary Moore
And Bob Maxwell.
rolls on among the events and non-events of 1927, one of the best years America ever had. Gary and I were talking about Lindbergh earlier and how he won a $25,000 prize for making the first successful solo flight from New York to Paris. Well, another $25,000 prize was offered that same year, this one to anyone who could swim from Catalina Island to the California mainland. Now, the distance is about 22 miles, but the water is very rough there. A whole lot of people set out all at once, but only one man made it.
I hope the others didn't drown.
Oh, no, they had plenty of boats to fish him out.
Huh?
But the winner was a 17-year-old Canadian lad. It had taken him about 16 hours, which is almost half as long as it took Lindbergh to fly 3,600 miles.
Well, that sure takes the cake as the non-event of the year, Bob.
It does.
Congratulations. Except possibly for this. In 1927, the Army staged enormous cavalry maneuvers down in Texas with 280 officers, 4,000 men, and about 4,500 horses and mules. The big question was, should they dye the white horses brown so they couldn't be seen?
That's incredible, isn't it? We've sure come a long way.
Yeah.
But, Gary, how about this for non-events? 1927 was the 50th anniversary of the invention of the phonograph. And the inventor, Mr. Thomas Edison, made this tremendously moving speech.
The first words I spoke in the original phonograph. A little piece of practical poetry. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
The old inventor. Do you know when I read somewhere, Thomas Edison, of course, wound up in his late years as a very close friend of Henry Ford I.
Mm-hmm.
And at one time, just prior to his death, he believed that there were little men running around inside his head pulling levers and switches and cords and things, motivating his movements.
You mean quite truly he believed
Quite truly he believed that in his last few days or months or whatever. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it is indeed. Well, let me play you one of Mr. Edison's own cylinders recorded in 1927. Well, here is Oreste and his Queensland Orchestra, and the selection is Moonlit Waters, and the vocalist is a lady named Vaughn DeLeith.
Vaughn DeLeith?
Yeah.
Oh, she goes back a long way.
Oh, she was great. She was on the radio before there was radio almost. But here she is on a 1927 cylinder.
Genuine Edison cylinder from as late as 1927. But now, Gare, let me play something for you that's a bit more up to date. You remember Ted Lewis?
Oh, sure. He's the one with the cane and the silk hat, and he always said, "Is everybody happy?"
That's the one. Well, here's one of Ted Lewis's big hits, recorded November 22nd, 1926, but released in 1927. It became an all-time classic, When My Baby Smiles at Me.
Ted Lewis. You know, I don't think he was one of the great bands, but he was certainly very popular.
True.
And he always had great men.
Mm-hmm.
I saw him at least 25 years after that, and he was in good shape still. And, Bob, that just whets my appetite for that mellow sound of the foxtrot. Early swing, hot jazz, and rhythm from the late 20s. The Mighty Memory Mobile with Maxwell and Moore will pause for just a moment, but don't go anywhere. And the Mighty Memory Mobile with Maxwell and Moore, Robert and Gary, that is, continues down the yellow brick road to the year of 1927.
You said earlier, Gary, that 1927 was one of the best years America ever had.
Yeah, and one of the exciting events, apart from Lindbergh and so forth, was, of course, the coming of sound in the movies.
Which I always think of immediately, Al Jolson and the Jazz Singer.
That's right. But you have to remember that this was not technically the first motion picture with sound.
Well, I recall they had to put sound or music on cylinders or records or something and play them along with the film.
That's right.
But the big trouble seemed to be that they didn't play the record at exactly the same time as Jolson was moving his mouth or whatever, right?
When the girl opened her mouth, the boys' lines came out. What made the Jazz Singer important was that the sound was actually recorded on a strip along the side of the film so that it could not get out of sync.
And didn't people try to go behind the screen to see where the musicians were sitting?
Yeah, something like that. And after that lengthy introduction, here is what electrified people back in 1927 when the Jazz Singer opened.
Blue jays, they came, falling and gone, nothing but blue skies from now on. You like that, Mama? I'm glad of it. I'd rather please you than anybody I know of. Mama, darling, to find a success in this show, well, we're going to move from here. Oh, yes, we're going to move up in the Bronx. A lot of nice green grass up there, and a whole lot of people you know. There's the Ginsbergs, the Guttenbergs, and the Goldbergs. Oh, a whole lot of birds. I don't know them all. And I'm going to buy you a nice black silk dress, Mama. You see, Mrs. Friedman, the butcher's wife, she'll be jealous of you. Oh, no. Yes, she will. You see if she isn't.
And I'm going to get you a nice pink dress that'll go with your brown eyes.
No,
What do you mean, no? Who is telling you? What do you mean, no? Yes, you'll wear pink or else. Or else you'll wear pink. And, darling, Mama, listen, I'm going to sing this like I will if I go on the stage, you know, with this show. I'm going to sing it jazzy. Now get this. Blue sky, smiling at me, nothing but little blue sky. Do I see? Mammy, I'm coming. I hope I didn't make you wait.
I remember reading a lot about that. That was quite a momentous occasion. Certainly here in New York area it was.
Oh, it was all over the country, even down in Baltimore.
Did you go to see it?
We heard about it down there. No, I didn't go to see it. First of all, there were very few theaters that were equipped to play it, you know. But it gave rise to a whole new word or phrase called theme song. I don't believe up until then that they had theme songs. For instance, from the film Seventh Heaven with Janet Gaynor and Charles Farrell. There was the one called Diane.
You mean I'm in heaven when I see you?
Smile, Diane, Diane, so forth. That was a silent film, essentially. Now, we do not have those soundtracks, but we do have one from 1928, one of the next sound films after the jazz singer, and it was called Ramona. It starred Dolores Del Rio, and here she is.
Don't you hear my call? Ramona.
That was Ramona, sung by Dolores Del Rio. We'll be right back. Bob Maxwell and Gary Moore on the mighty Memory Mobile.
So the mighty Memory Mobile wobbles forward, and I don't think we have as yet, Bob, done justice to the glorious tunes of 1927.
1927 was a good year for music then, wasn't it, Gary?
Oh, it was nifty year. Here's one that was introduced in 1927 and still seems to be an instant gloom chaser. It was introduced in a great Broadway show called Good News, written by Buddy DeSilva, Lou Brown, and Ray Henderson, who were one of the great songwriting teams of a decade full of great songwriting teams. And the show was a football story, and the cast has been forgotten, at least by me. But the pit band was led by George Olsen. And it sounded pretty much like this.
Stay after school and learn how it goes. Everybody do the varsity drag.
The Varsity Drag, from Good News, a hit Broadway show of 1927.
I remember loving to try to sing that thing. I had an older sister, she was just old enough. She was 6 years older when I was 12 years old. But when she would bring home things like the Varsity Drag, and they would all do all the dances, I would sort of stand in the corner and remember being quite thrilled by it all. Some of the songs from 27 were so popular that they've been imitated to death and turned into cliches. And this, I think, is the original of the Vo-Do-Do-Do-Do numbers.
Vo-Do-Do-Do,
Vo-Do-Do-Do-Do-Do-Do, recorded by Irving Aronson and his Commanders in 1927. It's called Crazy Words, Crazy Tune.
Do-Do from 1927. Okay.
Yes, sir. Now, how about this? A tune that just says instant 20. Early sound films, when they had crashes and gunshots, would just wreck the recording. And the actors kept bumping into the microphone, and a lot of people in the movie business were wildly against it. They said that people wouldn't like it.
Remember Gloria Swanson's great line in Sunset Boulevard? She said, "We didn't need to talk. We had faces."
And she still does to this day.
Indeed.
But they claimed in those days that people would be disturbed by the sound, that they were used to the look of silence, and that it would be an intrusion on them.
Well, John Gilbert, who was the great silent star, was reported to have not been able to make it into sound movies because of something with his voice, a timbre or something. But I have since read that that wasn't really true.
Yeah, I read the same thing. He said it was due to a great many intense interior problems that he was undergoing at the time, and this might have been a small contributing factor, but it really wasn't the reason for his subsequent suicide when he just quietly one night at a party walked out without anybody missing him and kept walking out into the ocean until he disappeared.
Well, early sound films weren't all, if I remember right, all sound. Didn't they have some that were part silent and part sound in the early days?
For most of them, as I recall, they concentrated on what to me is the most difficult of all. They concentrated on the music.
Songs and that kind of
Yes,
thing.
the dialogue would all be silent, but then when they came to the songs, they would stop and they would put it on sound. And I've never known why that is so.
That would have been kind of startling to sit there watching a silent movie and suddenly the man or woman gets up to sing and then there you hear their voice.
That's
Instead
right,
of the little
yes.
tinkling piano down front.
The personification of the flapper, sung by a guy who had a style all his own, the original light-voiced crooner. But you know, one reason why crooners were so popular?
Why is that, Gary?
Their voices recorded so well on the rather primitive microphones of the time.
Sure.
In any case, here's Gene Austin with Jack Yellen and Milton Ager's great song called Ain't She Sweet?
Don't you think that's kind of neat? I ask you confidentially, ain't she sweet?
Gene Austin. That's a great song, too, Gary.
Yeah, he was a good entertainer.
We weren't kidding when we said 1927 was a great year for music.
Well, Memory Mobile has to pull off the road for just a moment, but it will return. The mighty Memory Mobile of Maxwell and Moore, or Moore and Maxwell, rolls on through the hills and dales of that terrific year, 1927.
Now, Gary, I refuse to admit I remember Hill and Dale. But there was Smith and Dale, and Van and Skink.
Van and Skink.
A lot of entertainers that seemed to come in pairs in those days, before
Very-
Bob and Ray.
Very famous one, Gallagher and Sheehan. And you remember Moran and Mac?
Oh, my goodness, the two black crows in the jailhouse.
That's
What a
right. Used
great
to
routine.
love to play that record inside and out, backwards and forwards and along the edges. Jones and Hare.
Those are the Happiness Boys, as not to be confused with the Sunshine Boys.
That's right. And they were also on the air at the time for a stocking manufacturer, and they were called Jones and Hare, the Real Silk Pair.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. They were actually the first comedy team on radio. By the time we reached 1927, they were veterans of 6 years on the air.
We've got one of their numbers for you, one of the biggest sellers RCA ever had. At least for those days of 1927, anyway. The Happiness Boys.
Billy Jones and Ernie Hare. And that was the theme song, originally, I believe, for the radio show called The Happiness Candy Company. It was recorded for RCA in 1927.
Are you still making cylinders at that late date, Gary?
Well, I believe that Edison never did give up on cylinders, and he kept producing them long after the rest of the world knew that the platter was the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And besides, he probably had a lot of good customers who still had cylinder machines in good condition and wanted the new releases.
Never thought of that.
So,
Well, speaking of famous duets or double acts or comedy teams or famous pairs of 1927, Gary, do you remember Jack Norworth and Nora Bayes?
remember Julius Sanderson and Frank Crummick?
Noble Sissel and Eubie Blake?
Oh, no, you have to reach further than that. Do you remember Coon and Sanders?
The Coon Sanders Nighthawks?
Yeah.
Well, yes, I think. Actually, it was a band that was first heard in Kansas City that went on to Chicago. Cooney and Joe, Carlton Coon and Joe Sanders. And this was their theme song from 1927.
Here Comes My Ball and Chain by a band almost forgotten nowadays, the great Coon Sanders Nighthawks. And it's a strange thing how things will cross your personal life. It happened that, I believe it was Carlton Coon who died first. And then Joe Sanders carried on with the Nighthawks for many years. And I was a kid announcer out in KWK in St. Louis, and I was doing the nighttime coverage of them from the Chase Hotel. And at that time, I became kind of secretly engaged to the gal to whom I was married for 35 marvelous years. And we hadn't even called home to tell our parents yet that we were engaged. But she went with me that night as I announced Joe Sanders and his orchestra. And Joe Sanders, not realizing that what he was doing, said on the microphone, our announcer is Gary Morfitt, which was my name at the time, was Gary Morfitt. And they do say that tonight he got engaged to the lovely Eleanor Little of Richmond, Virginia. And 2 seconds later, the phone rang long distance from our parents and friends from all over. Just a small personal footnote.
Well, Gare, remember this pair of entertainers. They were actually brother and sister. It is possible to have a great act and still have the same parents, I guess. This is the title song from a George and Ira Gershwin. Hey, that's another team from 1927. George and Ira Gershwin musical of 1927. The show is called Funny Face, and the performers, Adele and Fred Astaire.
Frankie, dear. Now that one is a rarity. Funny Face from a Gershwin show of 1927 with Adele and Fred Astaire.
The Memory Mobile will turn the corner, and we'll be back following this. The mighty Memory Mobile is now parked outside the stadium, and we'll take a look at sports, 1927. Bob Maxwell and Gary Moore as umpire and referee.
Well, now, in 1927, of course, golf was not the big thing that it is now. Mm-hmm. Golf was very much a gentleman's game, and
it's sure not now.
It sure is. No, I think that, it's nifty. Everybody gets out and plays, and not only that, they watch the golf games on television with bated breath and with just as much excitement as they watch football or that sort of thing. And golf has a tremendous acceptance now, but it didn't have in those days. And there was a very sharp social delineation between the professional golfer, who was looked down upon. They were never allowed to come into the front door of the clubs where they were being played. They always came around to the servants' entrance.
The professional golfer?
Yes, and I think it was Walter Hagen, who, in what year I do not know,
he with the knickers?
He with the knickers just walked up one day and walked in the front door, and he was champion, and nobody dared say, "Mr. Hagen, would you please go to the back door?" And that broke the bars down. Now, of course, they roll out the red carpet for them, and the professional is the hero of the club when he arrived.
Sure.
But anyhow, in 1927, Bobby Jones, who was very much the amateur gentleman golfer, won the British Open in St. Andrews in Scotland. And that, of course, is supposed to be one of the toughest courses in the world, and the competition was very keen, therefore.
Well, in 1927, of course, that would have been a big year for Babe Ruth. He hit his 60th home run that season.
Oh, yeah.
The season was 154 games. Of course, as everybody knows, in 1961, Roger Maris hit 61 homers, but he did it in 162 games, and more times at bat, of course. So I kind of like Babe Ruth's old record of 1927.
I must say, and Babe Ruth having come from my hometown, Baltimore, I'm a little partial to the Babe, too. And Roger Maris, for all of his great skill, through no fault of his own, was lacking in that mysterious thing called X quality. People never quite had a clear picture of Robert Maris, where everybody knew that strangely mincing little step that Babe Ruth had. You remember he would swat the ball a mile and then run around the bases like a little doll baby.
That's true.
With that great big chest and spindly little legs, he would mince his way around. He was a fellow to remember, both on the field and off the field. The legends about his behavior off field, which was stifled by the press, because in those days athletes were supposed to be the epitome of all that was fine, and as an example to young men. But little did young men know that the Babe was quite a fellow. In football, this was the period of another deathless name, actually, Newt Rockne. Oh. Everybody knows about Newt Rockne. He was the most famous coach in the history of football.
I guess.
With the possible exception, maybe nowadays, of Vince Lombardi. In any case, in the season of 1927, Newt Rockne's Notre Dame had 7 wins, 1 tie, and 1 loss.
Gosh, you remember, that must have been the 4 horsemen and all those people that played for Newt Rockne. And as a footnote to the world of sports, there was an extremely popular lady in 1927 by the name of Gertrude Ederle. She had swum the English Channel the year before, just in 1926.
Mm-hmm. And another popular fellow was Commander Richard E. Byrd, who had flown over the North Pole in 1926. He had flown the Atlantic in 1927, although he hadn't flown solo like Lindbergh. Amelia Earhart was very much in the news, the first lady aviator, or as they were called then, aviatrix.
Let me throw another couple of names at you, Gare. How about Isadora Duncan?
Oh, yes, shocking lady. She was a dancer who did all sorts of provocative things. And she didn't reach her fame in 1927, except in a very tragic way. It was the year that she died riding in an open automobile and she was wearing a long scarf, which trailed out in the wind behind her, and the scarf got enmeshed in the back wheel, and poor Isadora was strangled.
How about Billy Sunday?
Billy Sunday, the hellfire and brimstone preacher. Remember in the song, Chicago, Chicago, that title in town, that title in town? It says somewhere in there, the town that Billy Sunday could not shut down.
Lord knows, I bet he tried.
Yeah.
Well, the Mighty Memory Mobile will shut down now for a short while. We'll be back to visit more of the landmarks of that wonderful year, 1927.
This is Gary Moore
and Bob Maxwell. This is the Mighty Memory Mobile, that phantom bus that takes you back to revisit a year, sometimes not so very long ago.
It's the vehicle that lets you hear and feel and almost taste what life was like 1 year at a time.
At the controls, those two intrepid birdmen,
Gary Moore
and Bob Maxwell.
And at the moment we are traveling through the sunny landscape of what almost everyone agrees was a great year for all of us. And as we proceed, you'll be hearing this voice.
Some of these days you'll be so lonely.
And this great band.
And this vocalist who touched the heart of everyone who heard her.
I used to dream that I would discover the perfect lover someday.
Sophie Tucker, the Duke of Ellington, and Helen Morgan, the little gal who used to sit on the piano and sing in the speakeasies before she got too famous.
The year's 1927, and as we said, it was a good year. The rest of the world was in turmoil, but here at home it was rather peaceful. If you overlook prohibition and a lot of shooting, some violent crimes, and a few other elements.
Yes, Gary, there were some problems, all right.
One of the big controversies was the fight over Boulder Dam. Both Arizona and California claimed the water in the Colorado River, and there was a big fussing to do about it in Congress.
In 1927, we sent Marines to Nicaragua. Why? Well, there was a civil war going down there because two men claimed to be president. One was a liberal, one was a conservative. We supported the conservative, and to back up that support, we sent in several thousand Marines to keep the peace and keep people from killing each other until a bona fide election could be held. Does that have a familiar ring?
Long bag. It was a collection of folk ballads, and he himself used to sing them, playing the guitar, and he was one of the great originals of our century. And here he is, Carl Sandburg.
Oh, the boll weevil lamb, a little black bug come from Mexico. They say, I'll have a home, I'll have a home. The merchant got half the cotton.
We'll be back with the Mighty Memory Mobile in a moment.
The Mighty Memory Mobile with Bob Maxwell and Gary Moore rolls on. Well, actually, we haven't rolled a bit because we're still remembering some of the entertainers who made us all laugh back in the glorious innocence of that great year, 1927.
Gary, you mentioned Amos and Andy. Well, they had begun as Sam and Henry in Chicago on WGN back in 1926. 1928, they had changed their name to Amos and Andy and were being heard over the NBC station out there, WMAQ.
Now, I guess that everybody knows that they were what was called blackface entertainers. Mm-hmm. Actually, they were two white guys who impersonated blacks, or colored, as we said in those days.
I guess we've come a long way, Gare, and don't let anybody tell you differently.
I shall not.
But we do have a sample of Sam and Henry, Freeman Gosden, and Charles Correll from back in 1927. Now, Gare, this is old radio, so listen carefully.
Henry, that telephone ought to ring any minute now. The operator said that she'd call me back as soon as she could get Birmingham, but that's been 30 minutes ago.
I'm getting tired of hanging around here waiting for you now.
Wait a minute now, Henry, wait a minute. Don't rush off and leave me here. I gotta talk to Lyra.
Did the secretary tell you to use this phone?
Yeah, he told me to go ahead and use it, and then I could key him after I finish talking to it.
Well, you want to have your money ready.
I got a lot of keys right here in my hand.
I'm getting madder and madder now. The longer I stay waiting for you to talk to that crazy gal like it, the madder I get.
Wait a minute now, Henry, wait a minute. Don't leave me here. There it is now.
Take your time now. Take your time. Don't get so excited.
Hello? Yes, ma'am. I'll call in Birmingham.
What's she say? What's she say?
He says he's ready with Birmingham to hold the line. Hang on to Northern County here. I've got a lot of things I want to tell Liza. Hello? Hello, is this Birmingham? I want to talk to Liza.
Who's that you're talking to?
That's the lady Liza works for, I guess. He's going to get Liza to the telephone. I can't hear very good either.
Be careful now what you say to that guy. The first thing you know, you're going to be asking him to marry you.
But that's what I want you, Henry.
Uh-oh. Now I know you're tripping.
That's all right, though.
Sam and Henry, by the two radio entertainers who would become Amos and Andy just a year later. You remember that their phrases? Things like, I was regusted, and explain that to me.
And Madam Queen.
Yeah. So, yeah, had a secretary who sat right next to him, and he had a buzzer on his desk. And anytime he wanted to talk to her, instead of just talking to her, he would say, "Buzz me, Miss Blue."
I remember that. Yeah, how about Burns and Allen? They were a pair in 1927, weren't they?
Oh, they were indeed. I don't believe they were on the radio yet.
Oh, but they were in vaudeville, huh?
They were in vaudeville and had not yet made their debut, but they certainly hit when they hit.
I read a profile of George Burns, who, as you know, is enjoying great new fame now due to his appearance in the Sunshine Boys. And he was telling about how he had a heck of a time getting started in vaudeville. He'd been a dozen different names. He'd been a tap dancer, a joke teller, a juggler, a magician.
Yes.
And finally he met this little red-headed Irish girl named Gracie Allen, who never did change her name, of course.
Yes.
And he said from that moment on he was captivated. He said she'd given him an option. She said she was going on the road with someone else, unless he married her. He said, well, I didn't want to break up the act. So he married her, and I guess they were together for 40-odd years.
Yes,
Great
and they're
actor.
playing their old stuff on television now, and the great charm of Gracie is not only not diminished, it is magnified.
I think
with
you're right.
time. Now, here's another pair. Lady with a strange name, May C. Breen, and Peter Derose. Remember that? She was known as the Ukulele Lady, and they had a radio show that started in 1927 on the old Blue Network.
Back in 1927, NBC was only 1 year old.
Good heavens.
It had started in 1926. CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System, emerged in 1927, and I think it went through several reorganizations before it became the CBS we know and love.
No, they were very good to me for a number of years. Eventually fired me, for which I don't blame them, because the show I was on at the time was not doing very well. But over the years, they treated me most kindly. Now, here's another pair from 1927, and I don't think it's ever been equaled in its own milieu, Garbo and Gilbert. In 1927, they made a picture called Love, which was actually a version of Anna Karenina.
But in 1927, Gare, two movie stars got married.
Only two? Explain that to me.
As far as I know, Velma Behnke married Rod LaRock out of Edgrad, and Norma Shearer married Irving Thalberg.
Well, now, here is a performer who had been in vaudeville stages all over the world for many, many years. But in 1927, he was still treading the boards, as they say, and this recording was made in 1927 by Sir Harry Lauder.
By yon bonny banks and by yon bonny bridge, where the sun shines bright on Loch Lomond, where me and my true love wherever want to be, by the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond.
Harry Lauder, little Scotsman. I remember as a kid listening to his records and that adorable burr he had. He must have made hundreds of records and certainly performed for many, many years.
Yes, made more farewell appearances than Eleanor Adusa, I do believe. And here's another one, an extremely durable lady who had a very long career in vaudeville, on the stage, in movies, on radio, and I'm sure she appeared on television in her old age. But here she is from 1927, Sophie Tucker.
Some of these days, you'll be so lonely. You know it's gonna grieve me. Gonna miss your big fat mama, your mama. Some of these days.
The memorable Sophie Tucker. The song was by Sheldon Brooks, one of, as I remember, I think he was an accompanist of hers back in those days.
He was, yes, for many years.
One of the songs that she recorded in 1927. The Memory Mobile will take a short intermission at this point, but we will be back. The mighty Memory Mobile returns to continue its route up and down the corridors of the year 1927. One of the best years we ever had. At the controls, two spacemen, astronauts of the jazz age, Bob Maxwell
and Gary Moore. And you know the 20s are always called roaring. In your opinion, did the 20s really roar?
Why would they make that analogy, Gary? What was roaring about the 20s?
Well, I think it was being not too long after World War I. Suddenly, all of the austerity was gone, and the blankets were thrown off, and people just ripped loose for a while. They'd had enough austerity, enough grimness, and it was the year of the flapper, the times of the flappers, and F. Scott Fitzgerald and all that. And people just went on a mental vacation for a while.
Kind of like the swinging 60s, do you suppose?
Well, perhaps for a few of us. But I think the roaring 20s is sheer ballyhoo, really. On the other hand, the 20s were also called the jazz age, and there was plenty of jazz, heaven knows. Remember Fletcher Henderson?
Oh, that arranger and had his own orchestra.
Oh, yeah. Can't overlook him.
As I recall, he was one of the first jazz bands to have good sidemen who could actually read music, who could stay in tune, and who could not only improvise but play original arrangements for a band. Was that true, Gary?
That's right, and not to take anything away from Benny Goodman, but I think that had Fletcher Henderson been white, Fletcher Henderson's would have been the first big band, the first big swing sound. As it was, he settled for doing a great many of the arrangements for Benny Goodman. Of course, Duke Ellington. How about a couple of his numbers from that year?
Here's a real composition of the Dukes, not just a jazz arrangement of a standard tune. This is a passage from the great Black and Tan Fantasy, recorded for OK Records in 1927.
From Duke Ellington's Black and Tan Fantasy, as recorded in the year of our choice, 1927.
Gary, do you think we could squeeze in a few bars from another? Would you like to?
Oh, boy.
How about the East St. Louis Toodaloo? It was recorded in 1927.
That was another great Ellington number.
Isn't it hard to understand or believe today that once upon a time music such as we've been listening to, played by an orchestra such as we've been listening to, Duke Ellington, was restricted in the number of ballrooms it could play? It's staggering, you know, it really is.
Yes, it was strange that that a black band was not welcome in a white theater, which I never understood. After all, there was the antiseptic footlights to separate, if you like, the audience from the people on the stage. And if I wanted to hear the great black acts, I would have to go over to the black section of Baltimore to hear them, where I was made to feel quite welcome, I must say.
Yes, indeed.
And didn't feel at all strange.
Detroit was the same way. You could go to the Paradise Theater and see the black acts, but there was very few, if any, black acts that had played in the RKO Downtown Theater.
You know, one of the great names in jazz is one that I doubt many of our listeners would even recognize, and it's the name of Billy Strayhorn. And that was a strange thing, because Billy Strayhorn was the principal arranger for Duke Ellington. He was his alter ego. And I doubt if at this moment, if you could get them both back alive, that either Ellington or Strayhorn could tell you where one began and the other left off. It says on Duke Ellington's Sophisticated Lady, written by Duke Ellington. I believe that's the credit. Actually, it was mostly Strayhorn's. But Strayhorn didn't mind because he enjoyed being in the background. It gave him a freedom that Ellington didn't have. He could stay home and arrange and play with ideas, where Duke had to be the ever-present front man on the one-night gigs and all that kind of thing. But Billy Strayhorn and Duke Ellington, totally inseparable.
Immersed in each other's personality. Yeah. I see by the clock on the wall, Gary, that we're just going to have time to scratch the surface of the jazz records that were recorded in 1927.
Don't scratch the surface. These records are priceless.
We'll be right back. The Memory Mobile returns with Moore and Maxwell, and we're in the same groove of jazz records of 1927. Gary, see if this one rings a bell.
That's a number called Baltimore, with Ruby Bloom on piano and Wingy Manone on cornet.
Wingy Manone.
Wingy Manone, yeah.
Yeah.
You know why they called him Wingy? Did you ever work with him?
Sure, I worked with him, yes. He had that one arm.
One arm. We did a television show together one time. It was sponsored by a dairy concern. And just before we went on the air, they would pass out glasses of milk to all of the performers. And then the camera would go by and show each one of them taking a sip and smiling, and the announcer would say, "Here is the such and such a program brought to you by the Dairy Council." They got to Wingy Manone, and he looked at the milk, looked at the camera, and turned in a loud voice says, "What's this stuff?"
I can remember once in Chicago, I was walking down Rush Street to see who was in town, and in front of one nightclub, there was just a sign, big sign up that said, "Wingy Manone, come in and hear the truth."
Well said. We do have some records from 1927, as you have already heard. I wonder why they sound the way they do. Take that Baltimore one we heard, Gare. According to the discography, it was electrically recorded. But electric recording, I suppose, was only 2 years old in 1927. Before that, didn't they sang into a megaphone, and it was recorded that way, wasn't it?
Acoustic recording, I think, was when all the instruments would crowd around in front of the mic and just blast away, you know, and the vibrations would travel down into the needle, which would cut the groove right into the record.
I suppose it was a crude process. 1927, there were a lot of small labels that were still using the older product. Edison was still in business with the cylinders.
Well, what were the microphones in those days? I know they were not like today's ribbon and condenser microphones, so they must have been the old carbon mics, I guess. They created vibrations by a little box full of carbon dust, which would vibrate against a diaphragm.
Then the electrical recording translated vibrations into electrical impulses, and the process had to be refined that much further.
Well, now let's hear this. Washboard Blues with Red Nichols, Miff Mole, and Jimmy Dorsey.
You like that, listener? Then let's hear Humpty Dumpty. You'll listen to Bix Beiderbecke on cornet. They're still making cylinders at that late date, Gary?
Well, I believe that Edison never did give up on cylinders, and he kept producing them long after the rest of the world knew that the platter was the thing. And besides, he probably had a lot of good customers who still had cylinder machines in good condition and wanted the new releases.
Never thought of that.
So, 1927, it's called St. Louis Shuffle.
Fletcher Henderson Orchestra, music like that made the jazz age. The St. Louis Shuffle from 1927.
Fletcher Henderson wasn't the only great jazz ensemble at the time, however. He was one of many. And finally, a little of the Vo-Do-Do-Dio Blues, in which you're going to hear the Goofus. And I didn't make that up. I read it on this incredible printout from the Memory Mobile. But the Goofus was a kind of a keyboard harmonica, and almost no one could play it, either well or badly, except for a fellow by the name of Adrian Rollini, who was part of this group who called themselves, back in 1927, the Goofus Five.
We'll be back on the Mighty Memory Mobile very soon.
The Mighty Memory Mobile continues its whirlwind trip through the discography of the year 1927. One of the best years America ever had, and mostly because of the music, it seems. Bob Maxwell and Gary Moore doing a four-hand number on the control panel.
Some of the tunes the Memory Mobile has delivered to us so far in 1927 have been, well, collector's items in the world of jazz. or as it came to be known as that time, or about that time, swing, because the jazz had become refined, arranged, and orchestrated during the 20s until it finally became swing.
I'm sure that all through the 20s, a lot of musicians, black and white, continued to improvise, to just blow their hearts out in jazz clubs in, where? New Orleans, Kansas City, Chicago, Detroit, and of course, New York. But for most Americans, 1927, the real musical headliner of them all was Paul Whiteman.
Oh, sure, Gary. Pops had a huge band with great arrangements. After all, Gershwin was to write symphonic works for him.
That's right.
Paul Whiteman, who I had occasion to meet on several occasions, he lived in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, just before he died, was a trained musician.
In other words, Fletcher Henderson was a new kind of musician. He was modern. He didn't just rely on jungle rhythm. And to some extent, he helped to mold jazz into swing. A lot of white bands followed his style, and probably even, well, Goodman paid for the arrangements, but a lot of bands just swiped him.
Fletcher Henderson had his first orchestra, Gare, if I remember right, in 1923. And at one time or another, Louis Armstrong and Coleman Hawkins and Don Redman had played with the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra. Pops, of course, a lot of jazz musicians were trained, but Whiteman, well, he had played Rhapsody in Blue in 1924 and introduced that Gershwin work to the world. Whiteman played almost symphonic pieces.
By 1927, Paul Whiteman was a household word, like, say, Frank Sinatra. He even had a special label with a caricature of him on it on the phonograph records, saved only, of course, for him. Now, his record of Whispering, recorded a few years earlier...
To the vocal, do you suppose they recognized who it was, Gare?
Well, I would hope that they would. That was Bing Crosby, Al Rinker, and Harry Barris, who were known in those days as the Rhythm Boys. And that's where Bing started.
That's right. Paul Whiteman had recorded Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. Ferdy Grofé had written some production numbers like On the Crest of a Wave, all kind of formal and classical. But Pops had also recorded one that became a standard. It was cut late in 1927. The piano solo was by a young musician who is now a legend, who normally played the cornet. But in this famous arrangement, which he also wrote, he's on piano. Here is In a Mist with the Paul Whiteman Orchestra and Bix Beiderbecke.
From Bix Beiderbecke's In a Mist with Paul Whiteman's orchestra from 1927.
Well, Gary, I hope we're not pushing the memory mobile too far, but we ought to follow that with another tune, cut in the early months of 1928. In my mind, I think this is the sound of the 20s epitomized. It's Bix again, this time on cornet with Paul Whiteman's orchestra, and it's called Borneo.
Right down old Borneo way.
Well, I guess that's why they call the 1920s the Jazz Age. That was Borneo with Bix Beiderbecke, the Paul Whiteman Band, and an all-star ensemble.
The Memory Mobile will pause now, but we'll return soon. We haven't heard the end of 1927 by any means. Maxwell and Moore saying, don't go away.
The mighty Memory Mobile returns with its 2 tour guides through the highways and byways of history, 1 year at a time. 1927 is the destination for the moment, and the Phantom bus is, as usual, parked on Broadway, just above Times Square.
You know, Gare, Times Square looked pretty much the same in 1927 as it did today. Not quite so many Japanese manufacturers, perhaps, in lights, but just as jammed with marquees and signs and shop windows for tourists and bars and restaurants.
Yeah, a lot of smart girls, hustlers, hangers-on, song pluggers, cab drivers... What else? Delivery boys, out-of-towners, limousines, cabs, buses. You see, nothing ever really changes.
But it seems to me that there were some great shows playing in 1927. Of course, there was the Ziegfeld Follies. By 1927, the Follies were, hard to believe, 20 years old. And it introduced to the public all kinds of stars. People like W.C. Fields and Sophie Tucker, Ruth Etting, and even Will Rogers. But, Gare, we have a medley of the tunes from the Follies of 1927 with Nat Schildkret and his orchestra.
What would I do if it were you?
And that was from the Follies of 1927. There's a flock of real great songs. Also on Broadway, you could see Helen Hayes in Coquette. You could see a play called Burlesque, featuring a very sweet girl in a tragic role. She fell in love with a no-good burlesque comic, and her name is Barbara Stanwyck.
You can also see Earl Carroll's Vanities in 1927. That was the international edition.
And how about Rodgers and Hart's Connecticut Yankee? That was a real milestone.
Vincent Youmans Hit the Deck. One of the numbers from that show was this one. Louise Grudy and Charles King as vocalists.
Sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm blue. It's 'cause I love you, that's how I am.
Sometimes I'm Happy from Hit the Deck, a musical of 1927. It was a story about sailors on shore leave and would be made into at least 3 movies in later years. Well, the Memory Mobile seems to run out of gas. Pity that we never got to hear Irving Berlin's Blue Skies and a whole slew of others. We never found out why Calvin Coolidge did not choose to run for office in 1928. As Amos and Andy suggested, maybe his wife wouldn't let him.
So we have to pull away from the flappers and the bathtub gin and pull away from all the dandy music and singing.
Where the Memory Mobile will take its next trip, nobody knows, but we'll be there with bells on.
The Mighty Memory Mobile is produced by Cinema Sound Limited, New York. This is Maxwell
and Moore
signing off.